If there is no struggle, there is no compromise. Two years after the terrible fall of the stock market, one of the greatest conflicts in Southern history emerged. Before 1931, there had never been a trial in American history that had had so many reversals, convictions, and retrials. Hundreds of previous trials have ended just as unfairly as this one. Cases decided by the color of skin, and ending in death sentences for innocent colored men. In 1931, however, a trial erupted that tested Southern justice. A trial that relied on the testimony of two white women. A trial that left 9 black teenagers sentenced for death. A trial that may have inspired one of the greatest stories in American literature. The trial of the Scottsboro Boys.
It was 1931, and the sun had just started to set in the small southern town of Scottsboro, Alabama. Though slavery had been banned for 70 years before, racism and hatred were still very much alive in America. Fairness and equality were still unreachable to any African American, even before the arrival of the Jim Crow laws. This evening would change the lives of 9 black teenage boys, all bound together by their misfortune. For the Scottsboro Boys, all friends from Chattanooga, were hoping to find government jobs in Memphis, hauling logs on the river. The other 5 were from various parts of Georgia, none of whom knew each other or any of the other boys. 2 young white females dressed in overalls, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, also rode the train returning to Huntsville from unsuccessful job searches in the cotton mills of Chattanooga.
A small fight broke out between a few of the 9 boys and a small group of white boys. According to Victoria Price, when interviewed by a local newspaper the day after the alleged rape, the black teenagers threw the small group of white men off the train and then raped her and Ruby Bates. The men thrown from the train then went to the small town of Paint Rock and reported the black teenagers to authorities. Once the slow-moving train reached Paint Rock, the posse rounded up any black men they could find from the train. The teenagers were thrown in the Scottsboro jail, barely avoiding lynch mob. Ruby Bates and Victoria Price were accusing the 9 boys of rape.
Victoria Price and Ruby Bates were both described as notorious prostitutes by their neighbors and townspeople. In order to avoid charges of vagrancy and prostitution, Victoria concocted this dramatic but erroneous story before they arrived in Paint Rock, and Ruby went along with it. These 2 young women had created a death sentence for 9 black teenagers.
The fight between the white boys and some of the Scottsboro boys occurred in Last Gondola Car, 16. Price and Bates alleged that they were raped in the last gondola car, 16. Price and Bates also were first seen by the posse in Paint Rock next to the 4th gondola car, 12. A snuff box belonging to Price was found in the 4th gondola car, 12. Montgomery testified that he entered car 37 by himself and stayed there until he was arrested in Paint Rock. Robertson claimed that he entered car 39 and remained there until arrested in Paint Rock. Andy Wright testified that he was on the flat car 21 at the time of the fight and remained there until he was arrested in Paint Rock himself.
This diagram proves that it was virtually impossible for any of the Scottsboro boys to have raped Victoria Price or Ruby Bates. The 9 boys were tried in groups of 2 or 3. They were given only 15 minutes with their inadequate lawyers before being rushed into trial. Every single one of them was tried by an all-white jury, and at the end of each trial, 8 were given the death sentence, all except for 12-year-old Roy Wright, who was sentenced to life in prison.
Another factor that made freedom unattainable for the boys was the biased media coverage. The day after the boys' arrest, newspaper headlines were untrue and unfair. Headlines also described the boys as beasts unfit to be called human. Every Southern citizen read the newspaper articles as fact, not allowing the boys a fair chance to explain themselves. The boys were now in one of the biggest conflicts of their lives.
The moment the boys received their death sentences, the country reacted. People all over America protested and wrote letters and postcards to the Alabama government in support of the boys. Mothers and friends of the Scottsboro boys also protested in Washington, D.C. Eventually, the execution of the boys was postponed, and the boys would get a more qualified lawyer for the next trial.
The boys waited in inhumane prison conditions for their retrials to begin. The Scottsboro boys were abused by guards, lived in tiny dirty cells, and worked challenging jobs. One of the boys, Haywood Patterson, was stabbed 20 times by an inmate, who was paid to do so by a guard. Miraculously, he survived.
Two years after the incident, on March 30th, 1933, Haywood Patterson was retried for a third time. This time, however, he had a surprising witness, Ruby Bates. She told the court that she had never been raped and that Victoria had told her to lie so they would not be thrown in jail on moral charges. Her testimony was not convincing enough because jury members thought that the defense had paid her to join their side. Therefore, Haywood was sentenced to the electric chair for the second time.
After the trial, Ruby returned to New York and became one of the boys' strongest advocates. She marched in parades and gave speeches demanding justice and mercy. The third round of the trials was held in November of 1933. Judge Callahan was looking for a speedy decision and wanted to end the matter quickly. He completed all of the trials in 3 days, and all verdicts read guilty. His actions reflected the worst kind of institutional bias and injustice. At the end of the trial, death sentences were returned for Haywood Patterson and Clarence Norris.
On January 6, 1936, Haywood Patterson was sentenced to 75 years in prison in his fourth and final trial. Though this was still an unjust sentence, it was historical because it was the first time in Alabama history that a black man was not given the death sentence for being charged with raping a white woman. After the trial, all of the Scottsboro boys were held in prison for more than 5 years. During that time, 7 of the boys, excluding Haywood Patterson and Ozzie Powell, were finally given their second trial, only to be found guilty again.
Then came a magnificent surprise, and perhaps a compromise too. The Alabama prosecutors dropped all charges against the 4 boys. Alden Montegomery, Eugene Williams, Roy Wright, and Willie Robertson were free. In the midsummer of 1937, the boys arrived at Pennsylvania Station in New York City, and were welcomed by a large crowd of ecstatic supporters.
Over the next few years, the now men were released from prison on parole. Charles Weems was released in 1943, Clarence Norris in 1944, Ozzie Powell in 1946, and Andy Wright in 1950. Haywood Patterson, however, was still serving his 75-year term until 1947, when he broke out of jail. Shortly after breaking out of jail, he made his way to Detroit and stayed with his sister. 3 years later, the FBI found him and asked for his extradition. Michigan Governor Manon Williams refused and made Patterson a free man. At last, another fair compromise was made in the case of the Scottsboro boys.
Though all of the boys were eventually let out of jail and all charges were dropped against them, they all still lost their childhoods and were changed forever after spending years in a place that they didn't deserve to be. The Scottsboro boys' trial was a landmark conflict that helped in the fight against racism and segregation. These 9 teens helped give African Americans their full freedom.
If there's no struggle, there's no progress.
Those who profess to favor freedom and deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground.
They want rain without thunder and lightning.
And this is a song of the Scottsboro boys. Woody, Alabama, and you better watch out. The landlord thinks you're gonna jump and shout. Scottsboro boys, they can tell you what it's all about. Woody, Alabama, and you better watch out. The landlord thinks you're gonna jump and shout. Scottsboro boys, they can tell you what it's all about. I'm gonna talk to Joe Lewis. Ask him to listen to me. Don't he never try to make